And okay, live stream, got it.
I think it worked.
Yes, but Natalie, we can't hear you. You're muted. I see that you unmuted yourself, but we still can't hear you, Natalie. It might be because not only are you hosting Zoom, but you're live streaming it at the same time. Oh, Natalie, are you okay on your end?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes. There you are.
Okay. I'm so sorry. My phone, I had to do it on my phone because my laptop a little got messed up. But okay, well, I'm just going to do a little introduction. So hi, everybody. My name is Natalie. I organize within the field in Bakersfield, California, and we are a grassroots mutual aid organization in Bakersfield. And so we do a variety of projects like providing food and care items to curbside communities. And to be in community with curbside folks, we also let them know their rights as to like what enforcement code can and cannot do when they do sweeps. And my comrades have said that that is effective to them. For curbside communities have said that it is effective to them. And also to build autonomy with community members, we also try to work out an open fridge concept that we've been working towards so they can actually get their own groceries and their own food products that they need. And we also got in touch with a political prisoner in Delano by the name of Abdul Shakur. He is the co-founder of the Pan-African George Jackson University, and that teaches new Africans about their rights in prison. And one of the things they've asked from us is to sign their petition for reinstitution, as one of the prisoners right now was in solitary confinement for 30 years at the age of 16 and he solely got imprisoned in solitary confinement because he was doing organizing gangs like in union to be able to have political education, and basically because he also possessed like literature of New African literature. And so we're also raising funds for them, and I'll also be dropping down the petition down below. And so as part of our political education segment, we have Professor Dr. Dina Montague with us today, and Maya as my co-host. And Maya, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for the background noise if you hear that. Hi, my name is Maya. I am a fourth year environmental studies major student at UC Santa Barbara. I organize with SJP, which is Students for Justice in Palestine. And I'm also from Bakersfield. I am not a part of this organization. It sounds great, but I'm happy to be here and to learn more about both in the field and with Dr. Montague's work. You're muted, Natalie.
But yeah, that's a little bit about us. I got the pleasure to take environmental justice and community health with Dr. Montague. And I was lucky enough to actually be taught about the disparities communities do face from environmental injustices that have been put upon them. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. So yeah, I'll let Professor Montague take it over.
Well, thank you, first of all, so much for inviting me, Natalie and Maya. And I just really want to say that I admire the work that both of you are doing. It's not easy to do this grassroots organizing. But the work that you are doing changes lives. And I'm really proud to see that you all are doing the work that you are doing and continuing to really just in the struggle to make real change in this world. So I just want to thank you. And so I don't know what the format is. Did you want me to kind of just present slides or just kind of talk, or how do you want this to, what do you think is the best way?
You can do on points that you have. If you want, you can pull up a PowerPoint and I can share, or I can let you share screen. But yeah, I was just wanting either way, or we can just hold, it's like an informal discussion as well that we could hold, what you feel comfortable with.
Okay, well, at first I was going to do some slides, but I think maybe it might be better just to talk.
Okay.
What do you think? Yeah?
I'm good with that.
Okay. All right, well, I'll just kind of basically talk about what I was going to show with the slides, but just kind of, keep it more informal. And so really what I was going to do, and Natalie, you're probably familiar, it's a lot of this is kind of based on some lectures that I've done for the environmental justice and community health class, but really kind of thinking about how global politics and political economy impacts local lives. So we can think about how essentially the post-World War II structure, political and economic structure that became dominated by US capital, today impacts the lives of agricultural workers in Santa Barbara County. And so one of the driving questions I had when we were in class was, how is it possible that people are legally poisoned in the state of California? And so we have literally hundreds of pounds of pesticides that are dumped on human beings every year in Santa Barbara County. And so much of those pesticides are known carcinogens, are known to have negative health effects, including birth defects, cancer, all sorts of lung problems, right? And when we think about the era of COVID, especially that being particularly horrific. And so the process of actually getting to this point where we have the legal poisoning of people in our state and across the country, but I'm going to particularly hone in on our state and our county, really originates in the post-war system. Now, what do I mean by that? So essentially, prior to World War II, the United States was clearly not necessarily considered a global leader. And really, you had the European powers that during the war, really, after two wars, World War I and World War II, we see a significant decline in their power. And at the end of World War II, what then happens? You have a restructuring of global political economy. And there was a particular point, it's called the Bretton Woods Conference, really in 1944, that brings together the European powers and the US and the weakened European powers, and particularly the weakened Britain. And what starts to happen is that because the US is then a dominant financial power, especially essentially owning about 2/3 of the gold, and at that point, gold is pegged to the dollar, right? So you have a financial restructuring of the global economy that produces essentially three major institutions, one being the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and then essentially what then becomes the World Trade Organization. So what do these then do? Essentially what it does is start to define the global financial system within the parameters of how the US decides to define it. And this is when we start to see these terms such as quote unquote free trade. And so what the United States starts to do with its political leverage is start to force, let's say, for example, the British to open up. The British had basically, through their colonies, their colonial powers, had laid out a system of essentially protecting their economic, benefits from having these colonies. Had essentially set up a protective system so that it was the British themselves that would essentially be the sole beneficiaries of their colonies. And so the United States then says you must open up trade, quote unquote, free trade, to allow the United States to go in and start to penetrate into these economic markets. And so as this kind of global economic system is developing, alongside what you start to see is essentially an industrialized agricultural economy starting to develop as well. Now, there was essentially, industrialized agricultural economy wasn't necessarily new. In fact, we can trace back the development of agriculture, of industrialized agriculture, really to cotton production in the United States and the enslavement of Black people, of Africans in the United States. And we really see that actually driving the main driver of the US economy, particularly in the 19th century and the 18th century, right? But what we start to see is that these ideas of industrialized agriculture begin to accelerate in that post-war era. And one of the major events that happens is essentially the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution was established by this guy from the Midwest, Borlaug, who essentially in the 1940s starts to develop more uses of pesticides, and also, kind of early stages of genetic modification of agriculture. And really the idea behind that idea of the Green Revolution as it was stated during that time, was essentially that that as the global population was increasing, that Borlaug was saying that we are going to have essentially food insecurity. And so the idea was to create these kind of more, synthetic ways of developing seeds, would then accelerate food production. And the idea was essentially that if you accelerate food production through the Green Revolution, then you're going to be able to feed more people. Also, we're in the middle of the Cold War. And so the Green Revolution is not about a green being environmental, but it's essentially being green as opposed to red. Red meaning a communist ideology, right? The USSR and China and their approaches to agricultural production and collectivization. The US is implementing a system of a green revolution that is supposed to show an alternative to a communist approach to agricultural production. And so what then happens? So we have this new restructured economy that is heavily dominated by the US dollar and financial institutions, that starts to incorporate this idea of the Green Revolution, that essentially insists on the use of high levels of pesticides and fertilizers. And Borlaug actually ends up winning a Nobel Prize for his work, because for some people, they think the Green Revolution is one of the greatest things that ever happened. It does actually increase food production significantly. But for so many people who are smallholder farmers around the world, it actually decimates their livelihood and actually creates conflict and problems. One of the leading scholars who has spoken out against the Green Revolution and its effect, and in fact, the Green Revolution oftentimes is thought of in terms of its impact on India. There's a lot of studies that have looked at India, and one of the leading scholars who's been against the Green Revolution speaks out vocally about the Green Revolution and its horrendous impacts that it's had on smallholder farmers, is Vandana Shiva. And so she, basically talks about how not only do these pesticides harm human beings, but you're also seeing these native plants, these indigenous plants, start to be destroyed. And so one of the things Vandana Shiva has done is that she has actually been harvesting native plants that have not been touched by the pesticides and the fertilizers, so that to make sure that they can hold on to those indigenous plants. The other thing it did is that set up essentially a way in which you have the chemical industry increasing its productivity around the world. And thinking about India again, one of the major disasters that happened in 1984 was the Bhopal disaster, where you had a fertilizer plant essentially having these chemical leaks, and tens of thousands of people ending up dying due to the disaster in Bhopal. And so, so this Green Revolution coming out of this new kind of global structure, posited as a positive influence on the world by a dominant United States, and then creates a system in which large scale levels of pesticides are used around the world. And again, going back to the fact that it was first launched in Mexico. And so there was this idea of improving wheat production and getting rid of this kind of what is called a stem rust fungus. And so as this kind of green revolution is spreading, it's linked to this global financial system because essentially you're seeing larger agricultural farms, industrial agricultural farms starting to expand. Why is that? Again, the IMF, the World Bank is actually providing loans and subsidies to this agricultural, large-scale agricultural production, right? Almost as is the only way in which states can actually get financing. And so what that does is, again, another way in which local small farmers become kind of decimated in this kind of new agribusiness, era of agribusiness. That does many things. It destroys culture, right? Because as we know, food and food production and culture is really important. It also raises the levels of food insecurity, because whereas before people were growing a diversity of crops, they are now forced to into monocrops, right? Forced into only wheat or only corn. It is decimating soils. It is using to produce fertilizers requires a tremendous amount of water. So you're also depleting groundwater. You're using a tremendous amount of water that was not used before. You also need things like natural gas, fossil fuels to produce these pesticides. And so, so while you do see these monocrop production, wheat, corn, actually increasing, you're also seeing major health problems happening on the ground with local farmers. And again, culture being kind of ruined by the expansion of agribusiness into these areas. And again, going back to the fact that Borlaug gets this Nobel Peace Prize because it's seen from the Western perspective as something that's actually positive, a positive development for humankind. And so there's a term that's used sometimes, it's called functional dualism. So it's really this idea that there's sustained profits for industrial capitalists and increased poverty and dislocation for smallholder agricultural workers. Now, one of the things that's also not really discussed in terms of the Green Revolution comes along in the midst of, well, in terms of Africa, but India had already gotten their independence, but I can just want to bring this to Africa, West Africa for a second. So the idea that there is a need to increase agricultural production is really related to colonialism. Colonialism itself decimates local farming practices. And so when we think about, for example, a place like West Africa, where I do some research, you have the colonial powers coming in, disrupting local farming practice and forcing people into these monocrops. And again, going back to the idea that once you do that, that creates a sense of food insecurity and all sorts of other problems. And so in a bizarre way, the Green Revolution is supposed to remedy the problem that it actually created. And then what it does is as compound that problem. So that is essentially thinking about how we got to the point where pesticide use is so common that we just think of it as a normalized process in agricultural production. There was a study that was actually done in 1994 that essentially said that there was a way in which the United States could cut its pesticide use by 50%, but still provide, agricultural, sustain the agricultural production. But because again, going back to this kind of global political economy, because the idea of agricultural pesticide use has been so integrated into a kind of a capitalist production and a corporate production, that there's not necessarily the incentive by large corporations, Dow, for example, to actually reduce their use of pesticides. So going back to Mexico, and I want to kind of then try to link what's happening in the Green Revolution to, again, to bringing it to locally to the fact that it is completely legal to poison people in California. And so as the Green Revolution is accelerating and you're starting to see local farmers being decimated in the 1960s and the 1970s, by the time you get to about the 1980s, we have this new system that I'm sure you all know very well of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, again, being driven by the World Bank and the IMF, by them claiming that this is a new way in which they are going to increase productivity, reduce debt for the developing world. And so within this neoliberal structure, you have more of this idea of these kind of international integrated economies. And you start to see these new kind of agreements happening, in particular NAFTA, right? So NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, which is now called USMCA, is established in 1994. And again, this idea that somehow this, by reducing or actually eliminating all tariffs and having full free trade, is going to lift the economies of the US, Canada, and Mexico. And a lot of that is on this assumption that somehow these economies are all equal. But what happens is that, as we know, maize is a traditional crop that has been grown in the Americas for centuries. And in the United States has massive agribusiness that is producing corn. And not only that, what the US does is actually heavily subsidizes the corn production in this country. So between 1995 and 2020, approximately $116 billion has gone to the corn industry. And what does that do? That means they are producing more corn for cheap, and then they dump the corn in Mexico, right? And so it really drives down this cost of corn, and it pushes already vulnerable local producers out of the market. And so as this is happening, and as NAFTA is being discussed, particularly indigenous farmers in southern Mexico are very aware that this so-called free trade agreement is not going to help them at all. It is really geared towards, again, large-scale agribusiness. And so as soon as NAFTA is implemented, we see the Zapatista uprising, we see indigenous people organizing and saying that this is literally killing us. The indigenous population and local farmers were never invited to the table to discuss NAFTA. And so the ways in which that they can protest was the Zapatista uprising and other forms of protest. But then what essentially happens is that you start to see right around the time of NAFTA, a large-scale outmigration of indigenous farmers from southern Mexico directly coming to California. And so we can see this link, again, from the restructuring of the post-war system to the subsidies, to the agribusiness, to the the IMF and the World Bank insisting on large scale pesticide production to the displacement of indigenous farmers from southern Mexico and coming to the United States. Now, again, going back to this idea of large-scale agriculture in the United States being rooted in slavery, that essentially, that system that had already been established in the United States essentially led to this essential pattern of exploitation of agricultural workers in the United States. And so what essentially the Mexican workers who were coming here were essentially placed within an already established system that had initially exploited Black workers, were exploiting Chinese workers in California, exploiting Japanese agricultural workers, right? Exploiting Chinese workers, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act happens, exploiting Japanese workers, and then we see the internment or concentration camps happening for the Japanese workers. We have Filipino workers also coming with high levels of exploitation. And then as we're seeing this massive migration, we also had the Bracero program and other programs that were bringing Mexican agricultural workers here. But particularly after NAFTA, we see these workers kind of falling into these patterns of pure exploitation that had been happening in California for decades. And so there's a quote from a book that we read in class, The Farm Worker's Journey, that says, today, agriculture on both sides of the border is best characterized as a binational system of integrated, complementary capitalist enterprises. So this capitalist movement in Mexico, pushing out farmers, and this capitalist enterprise in California, essentially laying the groundwork for exploitation. And then on top of that, again, going back to this normalized use of highly toxic pesticides. So I want to maybe talk about so let me just talk about the California agricultural system, right? And so California is essentially the leader in the country in agricultural production. It's a $50 billion industry. In 2019, right? It was estimated that the agriculture and farms and ranches in California actually produced about $50 billion in revenue. And in Santa Barbara County, especially, right? Some of the top agriculture commodities in Santa Barbara County is a lot of it is strawberry production. And strawberry production uses a lot of pesticides. So the strawberries, I think in 2020, the industry made about close to $2 billion in revenue. And in some of the figures that I've found in terms of the pesticide use, the figures, I have some figures from 2016, the total pesticide use in California was over 190 million pounds of pesticides in 1 year. So we're talking close to 200 million pounds of pesticides. In 2018, the total use of pesticides in Santa Barbara County was about 5 million pounds. Now, the statistics and the data that they have for Santa Barbara County, for Santa Barbara County is essentially the whole county, right? So they'll basically estimate, okay, it's 5 million pounds of pesticides in 2018 in Santa Barbara County. But we know these pesticides, they're not spraying in downtown Santa Barbara. They're not spraying in Montecito. They are spraying in a relatively small area in North County, right? Santa Maria, Guadalupe. So when we think about that, that's about 5 million pounds of pesticides in a relatively small area. And so again, it goes to this idea that it is legal to essentially poison people in our state and in our county. So I'll go into a few of the pesticides that are used. And one of them is called chlorophyphos. And it's commonly used in agricultural production. It was first actually put on the market in the 1960s. And California actually was a top user of chlorophyphos. And it was finally banned in California in 2020. So just recently it was banned. But there had been studies, and even in 2003, the EPA really started to link chlorophyphos to developmental harm in children. And so why did it continue to be used, and why do we see so many other pesticides being used? Chloropicrine is also commonly used in strawberry production. And that is also, chloropicrine actually has its roots, and many of these pesticides have its roots in chemical warfare from World War II. So when we see these chemical agents being developed in warfare, then they were repurposed later for pesticide use. So why is it okay? Why is it legal to use these pesticides that have been proven to have these terrible health effects on human beings? And UCLA actually did an interesting study. They did a study over time. This UCLA School of Law did a study in 2013, 2016, and 2018 to really kind of find out what's happening in terms of our politics that allows for these chemicals to actually be approved on the local and state level. And what is supposed to happen is that when a pesticide is being proposed to be used, then we have essentially two levels of this kind of regulatory framework for the use of pesticides. So to sell or to use the pesticides in California at the state level, you're supposed to get approval essentially from the Department of Pesticide Regulation. So they're supposed to consider all safer alternatives and mitigation options, and also evaluate the potential use, and then say, okay, what are the alternatives that we can use? And on the county level, also, there's this county agricultural commission. And so the growers submit their application to get a permit to use the pesticides. And again, they must consider all these safe alternatives to see, if there's essentially proven to be high levels of harm, then you should use other alternatives. So what the UCLA study found is that when this process of approval is happening, that what's happening is that they are not when they are supposed to consider an alternative, they're simply not. And so in this study, they were looking at approximately 50 counties in California, and they found that about 24 of the counties didn't even consider an alternative at all. And then a few of them, the alternatives were discussed. But so for the most part, during this process, we're seeing that there's a failure on the state and the county level to actually say, we are going to try to consider an alternative rather than these very toxic, highly toxic pesticides that we know have severe negative health effects. The other thing that they do is that they rely on private parties to evaluate potential alternatives. These are private parties that often have conflicting interests. And what we also see is that there's really oftentimes a lack of public records on the county level that show some sort of oversight or evaluation. And so we're seeing this kind of essentially this political failure to really intervene in the system to say, no, you cannot use these particular pesticides. And also to say, honestly, that you should reduce the amount of pesticides, right? And so this is why we're seeing, and as I said, particularly in the strawberry production, which is one of the highest producing commodities in Santa Barbara County, you're seeing kind of massive amounts of pesticide use, chloroprocaine, and other uses in Santa Barbara County, again, concentrated within the North County. So there's also other pesticides that are used to be methyl bromide that was actually banned in 1991. But it wasn't phased out until much later. Health effects such as severe lung damage, neurological damage, liver damage, kidney damage, heart damage. It was replaced by methyl iodide, which also has severe health impacts like impairing fetal neurological development, right? Causing fetal death in lab animals, all of these things that are known, but then are still getting approved through this flawed process. And also the other thing is when we think about the pesticides, is also getting into our groundwater and other issues in terms of environmental in terms of environmental justice. And even if we're thinking about not only the legal uses of pesticides, but we also have the illegal uses of pesticides, right? And so the Department of Pesticide Regulation in 2021 actually found there were in Santa Barbara alone, 42 violators of use of illegal pesticides. So we're talking about the legal use of pesticides and the illegal use of pesticides in this county that are causing serious health impacts. And so lastly, I want to kind of bring it to COVID. And so as you know, right, these pesticides have severe impacts as they've been studied on lungs. And we also know that in Santa Barbara County, where did we see the highest levels and the highest rates of COVID was in North County. We also know that agricultural workers were declared as essential workers. They were forced to work during COVID, right? Because people were saying we needed food, they have to continue working. And so what happened when we were doing, my team and I were doing some interviews with agricultural workers, right? We also found out because as I was saying, right, many of the agricultural workers are coming from Southern Mexico, they're coming from indigenous communities. Many of them are not native Spanish speakers, they're speaking Mixtec and other languages. And the farm owners were not conveying warnings about COVID in their language, right? And again, declared essential workers and forced to work during the height of COVID. So one of the things that I'm working on with my team is to try to see, one, so if we can visualize the impact of pesticide use to show the high levels in North County, and also to think about what is the link between the higher levels of COVID in North County and also as the intersection of these pesticides that are negatively impacting people's lungs. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there's the Paycheck Protection Program that many people know about, that is was designed by the government to essentially help out businesses that were impacted by COVID, by the shutdown, and things like that. And so businesses could then apply for the Paycheck Protection Program and get funding that was essentially supposed to subsidize their workers who were no longer working, right? So you have a restaurant, many people can't work because you're shut down, you get the Paycheck Protection money and it goes to your workers so they can live. Well, what happened is that what we found is that some of the highest levels in monetary recipients in Santa Barbara County are actually the farms. And so the farms, in particular the strawberry farms, are getting millions of dollars, multi-million dollars in Paycheck Protection money. So we have, for example, Darren's Berry Farm in Santa Maria receives over $5 million in Paycheck Protection money. Right, so we have other farms across Santa Barbara, they're getting, $4 or $5 million. Well, the question then is, if your agricultural workers are essential workers and they're working all the time, and the Paycheck Protection money is actually for workers who are not working, then what happened to that money? So essentially, all of these farms who are getting millions of dollars have said, the entirety of this loan is going to payroll. Well, whose payroll? Most of these farms have listed very small numbers of people who are actual employees. So then are they considering their agricultural workers employees? Because as I know of now, I am not hearing that they're getting a distribution from this Paycheck Protection money. And so that's another layer to think about in terms of COVID. So it's not just the high levels of use of pesticides, right? That's negatively impacting people's lungs, but it's also the fact that these farms are getting all of this money and we're not quite sure where it went. It doesn't seem at this point, and we haven't finished our research, that it has been distributed to agricultural workers. So in sum, we see this kind of shift, right? This 20th century shift towards an American dominance. That American dominance then pushes these pesticides and fertilizers that then disrupts local communities, local farms, local culture. It then pushes people out of their traditional homelands into an exploitative system in the United States. And then because of political failures on the state and the county level, then it is legal to then dump millions of pounds of pesticides yearly on agricultural workers. And then when we have a pandemic, a crisis, they are not protected by the farm. In fact, the farm potentially could have gotten millions of dollars from the United States government and not distributed it to their workers. And in addition, did not even put in the effort to actually inform the workers in their language about what is happening. And again, higher levels of COVID in North County. And so, yeah, so that's kind of trying to connect kind of the global to the local. Oh, one last thing I want to say. So there are amazing organizations, right, such as CAUSE, Central Coast Alliance for Sustainable Economy, Mixteco Indigenous Community Organizing Project, the Little House in Guadalupe, right? They're incredible activists who have been doing this work on raising awareness about agricultural workers, advocating for them, essentially ensuring that there is some sort of food security, all sorts of things. These organizations that have been working for years are doing incredible work in Santa Barbara County. And so I just want to just kind of recognize that work that they're doing.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I do have a couple of questions. It was very informative. So no, I'll comment right now. So it's funny that with Paycheck protection, they were still not able to provide their workers for money. And yet, even just this year, I found out through like talking with community members that they just got approved for like having overtime pay just this year. And I was like, what? Like, it's crazy to me, honestly, because I just couldn't believe it. And also, like, I also found out that 12 of the community members that are working on a nursery right now in Bakersfield, they developed breast cancer. And I was like, how is it that 12 women developed breast cancer? Like in the same nursery that is very exposed to pesticides. And it was not fun to hear, but I like how you mentioned there are organizations actually doing the work. And as to what are they working towards? Like, what is it that they're doing to bring that awareness so we can help or bring that awareness up as well? If you could tell me about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that maybe I would encourage you to invite them into your forum, because honestly, I don't know if I could kind of speak to all of the things that they're doing, but they're working on like housing justice, immigrant rights, worker rights, environmental justice, language justice, organizing for higher wages, all sorts of things that they've been doing. These organizations have been doing. Food security, right? One of the horrible ironies is that many of the agricultural workers can't afford sufficient food. And so one of the guest speakers we had in class, Alan Diaz-Correa, right? He works at CEC, Community Environmental Council, who's been really working a lot to ensure that that the farm workers can have access to fresh fruits at the farmers market at a lower cost. So there's many different ways that these organizations are working for justice in our county. But yeah, I think you should bring them on because they could definitely speak to it better than I can.
No, thank you. I will ask you about their contact. But
I have a question.
What was that, Maya? If you want to.
No, I said I have a question, if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for all of this information. Being an environmental studies student, like, yes, I have learned about some of these issues, but not like, I don't know, just not going more in depth. So thank you for that today. I got to learn a few new things. So I just wanted to ask then, like, what policies, I guess, are currently in place that is allowing for this continued use of these illegal pesticides and the illegal like dumping onto humans? Is it solely maybe just a lack of regulation within the system as a whole? And then another question I kind of had that you could tie into that was just in your personal opinion, or there's other research out there, like, what do you think is needed within like the agricultural field to create this shift in mindset away from pesticide use and in promoting like a better health for their workers and in working to minimizing further degrading our environment?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is because there is this regulatory framework that is actually in place, but it's just flawed, right? The process is flawed. And so if it's saying essentially that you have to evaluate potential risk, and then you have to consider safe alternative and mitigation options, but that's simply not happening. And so I think part of the reason is that there's not as much attention on pesticides as there should be. I think there's almost a normalization. Like we as Americans are just kind of like, oh yeah, pesticides are used. Like we don't really think about the levels. Oh, that's not really good, but there's a sense like, oh, but you have to use it, right? We've been normalized to believe that it's a necessary kind of evil, a part of the agricultural production. And the growers will say the same thing, right? What the growers will say is that if you're growing, you have to grow like the perfect fruit. Otherwise, Americans are not going to eat it. They're not going to be able to sell it. And so the growers are like, what are we supposed to do? We actually have to use these pesticides. So I think maybe there needs to be a reevaluation on the necessity of it. And like I mentioned, there was this article that came out, this academic article that came out in the 90s that was like, we can actually reduce this by 50%, but you're not necessarily seeing the levels of study I think that you might need to actually make a substantial shift away from the pesticide use. I think that's one of them. I think the other thing is like that UCLA study by the UCLA Law School was really important because it basically then shines a light on the failures within the political system. And so perhaps if there was pressure to say, okay, at the county level, at the state level, we are going to make sure that a consideration of alternative must happen, right? If there was pressure put on the agricultural commissioners to say, are you actually seeing alternatives? And maybe that's a space for activists to say, let's start organizing, and seeing like showing up if they have public hearings, or, if there's an ability to actually, find out what's going on, or, ensuring a sense of more transparency to say, are you actually considering alternatives? And, maybe that's something that could be happening on the Santa Barbara County level, that people could say, like, to what extent are you actually considering alternatives? These are alternatives and things like that. But I think because there's a lack of a spotlight on it, right? There's very few studies on it. That has just been accepted. And as I was saying, like this kind of post-war system that was established, essentially forced us to normalize pesticide use. And so I think that's part of the problem.
Thank you so much. I definitely agree. Throughout your talk, it was just reminding me of like a whole bunch of stuff. It makes me think about how normalized oil is, and like that's not okay. It made me think about this isn't related to pesticides, but still chemical pollution from DuPont. That happening, like that's a wild story. But yeah, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it also, you mentioned India briefly, but it was the local farmers also in the India uprising that had this issue, correct? Well,
so
it was
in India.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's so interesting because like I remember when I first learned about the Green Revolution, a lot of the focus was on India. Right. So a lot of times people are like, oh, the Green Revolution, they link it to India. And then as Vandana Shiva, I mean, thank God for her, she's so amazing, was like, this is a real problem. And so she really has been a leader in terms of, were you all familiar with Vandana Shiva? Just curious.
Yes, from your class, I believe.
Yeah, she's incredible. In fact, in the last International Documentary Film Festival in Santa Barbara, there's a wonderful documentary on her. So I forget the name of it, but if you want to do some research on like this documentary on Vandana Shiva, I think it's incredible. And even with your group, if you're able to find this documentary to show it, because she, people just painted her as a crazy lady. I mean, she's brilliant. She's a brilliant woman. And it was just like, again, Borlaug wins this Nobel Prize. Everybody's seeing Borlaug as the savior of humanity. And here comes this brown woman saying like, no. This is actually creating violence. It's creating health hazards. It's destroying culture. And I'm going to go around and I'm going to collect all our native seeds and put them away so that your pesticides do not tarnish them. And so Vandana Shiva really, starts to see kind of local conflict starting to happen, after this kind of push. You don't really have a choice, right? You can't get particular loans if you're not using certain pesticides, et cetera, et cetera. And so what she's starting to see is that it's actually creating more local conflict. Again, when you're also producing these monocrops, you're not able to feed yourself. This is when we start to see, right? Again, I can bring it to kind of Africa, where I know a little bit more, right? This idea that you start to import food rather than being able to produce it locally, because there might be a particular crop that you're producing, but in order to kind of have essentially enough substance, you have to import food, right? And so this idea that you're disrupting local agricultural practices, you're forcing them into a kind of a global economy that is slanted towards American agribusiness. It creates food insecurity in certain areas. And so she's saying this food insecurity then leads to conflict, in addition to the fact that in Bhopal, right, you have this large plant that's producing fertilizer that then poisons, tens of thousands of people. And so she sees it as one of the Green Revolution as being one of the most destructive things that have happened to our food production.
Thank you. I know you mentioned it a little also, but what are the projects that you have been working on in Africa?
Yeah, so actually I work on a clean energy project there. So one of the things, and this is linked also to colonialism, especially late colonialism in Africa, right? So you had literally what they call late colonialism. Africa came later, it stayed later. And by the time the British and the French and everybody else who got there, they basically had perfected colonialism and exploitation. And so the colonial system was never set up for the people, right? It's a system of economic exploitation. And so essentially the infrastructure, there was a lack of infrastructure that was established, and that essentially continued into the post-colonial era. So when you see, sometimes I show these maps of energy access around the world, and in sub-Saharan Africa, there's like something like 70% of people in rural areas don't have access to sustainable energy. You really cannot grow an economy if you do not have energy access, et cetera. And so there are all sorts of ways that people say like, oh, you have this international community coming in and maybe like setting up solar arrays, but it's done in a sloppy way. Things don't really work, right? You've got people importing solar panels that also really don't work. And so all these ways in which the energy infrastructure hasn't been established. And so what we're doing with my team is we're saying, actually, let's actually build solar panels locally. So you can actually build a solar panel from components. You solder it together and you make yourself a solar panel. And so the idea is essentially what I'm doing with my team is to find out ways that we can tailor our panels specifically for the climate in where we are we're working in northern Ghana. So things that we know, heat, humidity, dust accumulation, all of these things have a negative impact on solar panels. And so if we're building them ourselves and actually tailoring them to essentially deal with the high levels of heat, humidity, and dust accumulation, the idea is that we can build them at the same cost, or hopefully at a less cost than defective imported panels. And then through kind of like a community project, that when you're involving the community in the actual production, you're more likely to have the energy expansion instead of having kind of this international, the community, international community or international organizations or corporations essentially just like setting up a solar array and leaving. So that's kind of what we're doing. And then part of it is too, we work at these really cool art centers. And so the idea also is like to integrate art into and culture into the idea of energy production. And so that way to kind of generate new ideas, because one of the things we're challenging is this idea that innovation and science is somehow monopolized by the West. We know that innovation in science is something that emerged from all different cultures. And so what happens when we, especially being in these art spaces, to allow for more kind of almost free thought to really generate these ideas about thinking about what local production looks like, what is the relationship to nature, to the sun, and all of these things, and kind of try to integrate that into the production process.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. What is this project called? Is there a name to it?
Yes, we're called Energy Rich. Okay. Yeah. And so I work with students from Stanford and also Ghanaian students. And so it's like, sometimes I call it harnessing the intellectual capacity of Africa and the diaspora for innovative clean energy solutions. Yeah, so kind of working across the Atlantic to try to develop innovative ideas.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate all the information you gave out. But yeah, Maya, do you have any other questions?
I just want to say thank you both for inviting me out here today. I really enjoyed this, and it's nice like learning outside the classroom, and yeah, it was just really awesome, and I look forward to just seeing more of your work.
Well, thank you both. And congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, it's been a run. But thank you so much for your time. This will be on our channel on YouTube if you want to check it out. But I appreciate the time you spent and just all the information again. But yeah, I guess that concludes our discussion today.
Okay, well, thank you both. And I know both of you have a really bright future ahead of you. And yeah, it's young people like you that give me a lot of hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna look into the amazing work you do.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good one.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.